in civil procedure today, we're continuing our in-depth discussion of specific personal jurisdiction and how you can find that through having a sufficient minimum contact. We're going through all the ways that the courts have really tried to push the line to see, is there sufficient minimum contact? So you can think of it kind of this way, where there's a scale. And you're on that scale and you're working up towards it, and the further you get up it, the more you're really kind of trying to push the line. How far can we make it before we actually violate due process? And when we violate due process, then there's no specific personal jurisdiction. And so all these courts are really kind of testing that boundary as they examine these cases. So we're going to talk about contracts right now and whether or not a contract is enough to establish sufficient minimum contacts, or rather to personally avail the defendant to the state. So we're going to look at Burger King versus Roodswicks, which in this case, I'll just say Defendant R. Defendant R entered into a franchise agreement with Burger King, in which they opened a franchise in the state of Michigan, in the Detroit area. And they were doing all their communications with Burger King, which was headquartered in Florida. So they were going through all their communications, and Defendant R had a hard time with this Burger King. They were not making enough money to pay their dues to Burger King in Florida. So they defaulted, and they tried to negotiate, and they couldn't come to an agreement, so Burger King told them to vacate the premises and to stop using all their branding. Well, the defendant refused. He continued to operate, and Burger King filed suit in Florida. So now the question is, can they file suit in Florida? And the court says that yes, the contract here, the franchise agreement, was a sufficient minimum contact. Now, the defendants in this situation had never been to Florida. I mean, one of them had previously done a little bit of training, just the franchise training that was required. But other than that, the defendants had never physically been to the state. But the court still said that they could find specific personal jurisdiction. And why is that? Well, we learned that two things from this case. Physical presence is not necessary. So you don't need to actually have ever really been to the state to be personally availed to that state, meaning you make the choice to be subject to that jurisdiction. So, one, physical presence is not required, but second, a contract alone is also not enough. Had the contract been with Florida, but they did all their dealings with the headquarters in Michigan, or rather the district office in Michigan, well then that contract wouldn't have been sufficient to actually find any specific personal jurisdiction. But it was sufficient in the case because they were doing all their dealings, all the negotiations were going through Florida, all the payments were going to Florida, and so they had personally availed to themselves to that state, understanding that they could possibly be subject to that jurisdiction as a foreign state. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Law Schoolers. Before I let you go, there are 4 things I want to say. The first thing is, if you enjoyed these episodes and if you enjoyed the website, I would invite you to go and join Law Schoolers Pro, and you can do that by going to lawschoolers.com/join. It's a way for you to support us, but there's also a lot of features there that I think you will enjoy. Second thing is that nearly all of our episodes are unedited. The only ones that aren't are pre-law materials, and the reason for that is so you can actually see the legal material in its raw form as I'm learning it as well. The third thing is that the information contained in these episodes are specifically only for educational purposes. They're not to be used as legal advice, and with that, the fourth thing is, if it is used as legal advice, we are not liable. That is, Law Schoolers is not liable for any legal outcomes. Thank you again for enjoying the show. Have a good one.